Good afternoon. I'm Linda Katehi, and I would like to thank you all for being with us today. This is one of the events in the 2014-2015 Chancellor's Colloquium Distinguished Series. Now it is in its sixth season, and we've had wonderful individuals who came to speak with us about issues in higher education, about the past for some of them, about the future for others, and about also the present with a very critical point of view in what is happening in higher education, not just in the US, but also around the world. We are very fortunate today to have with us this evening Professor Sir Nigel Thrift, Vice-Chancellor and President of the University of Warwick, and an international research figure in the field of geography. When the schedule was set up last year, we did not know that it would, at the same time, while Sir Nigel would be with us, we would have also the announcement of the new campus that the University of Warwick has decided to move forward with, and will be establishing this new campus in Placer County. And the plan will be to have 6,000 students in steady state in the future studying on this campus. So we are looking very much forward to getting to knowing more about that. And of course, to have Sir Nigel speak with us about higher education and his point of view on the future of higher education, especially as now we are talking about international higher education and how we have played roles in educating students across the globe. Now I would like to introduce David Beal, the director of the UC Davis Humanities Institute, and Emmanuel Ringelblum, distinguished professor of history, who will introduce Professor Thrift, as well as our moderator for this evening, which is distinguished Professor Mario Biagioli, with a joint appointment in the humanities and social sciences, and also in the School of Law. So with that, I would like to ask Dave to come forward. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you very much, Chancellor Katehi. Welcome, and thank you all for joining us for this conversation with Sir Nigel Thrift. I'd first like to welcome some elected officials who are joining us, I assume in connection with our new neighbor in the University of Warwick in Placer County. We have Jim Holmes, Kirk Uhler, Jennifer Montgomery, and Robert Wigand from the Placer County Board of Supervisors, John Vasquez from the Solano County Board of Supervisors, and Carol Garcia from the Roseville City Council. So welcome to UC Davis. Our format this afternoon will begin with opening remarks by Professor Thrift entitled Why Geography Matters, followed by a discussion with Professor Biagioli. Then the audience will be given an opportunity to ask their own questions of Professor Thrift. Allow me first to introduce our moderator, Mario Biagioli. Mario is a distinguished professor of science and technology studies, law and history, and director of the Center for Science and Innovation Studies. He is also my biking partner. For more than a decade, Mario has been studying problems of authorship and priority attribution in big science. He has published on the history of patenting in the sciences, the development of the specifications requirements, and the peer review of patent applications. Mario is currently working on a book entitled The Author as Vegetable, a book on the role of environmental concepts in contemporary discussions of the knowledge commons. His other current research interests include definitions of patentable subject matter and the role of secrecy in science. A former Guggenheim Fellow, Mario is a founding member of the International Society for the Theory and History of Intellectual Property. And now I'm honored to introduce our distinguished guest, Sir Nigel Thrift. As Vice-Chancellor and President of the University of Warwick, Professor Thrift has launched an ambitious strategy for Warwick's future and has led the university in increasing its research and philanthropic income and raising Warwick's international profile by establishing high-profile partnerships and research collaborations. As a scholar, Professor Thrift has maintained an active research career along his role as Vice-Chancellor. Among his current research interests are topics related to international finance, cities and political life, non-representational theory, and the history of time. Professor Thrift was made a Fellow of the British Academy in 2003 and appointed Deputy Lieutenant for the West Midlands in 2014. I'd like to know what that is. He was knighted for his services to higher education in the New Year's Honors List 2015. Professor Thrift is a member of the Governing Board of the European Institute for Innovation and Technology and a commissioner of the Marshall Aid Commemoration Commission. Thank you for being with us, Professor Thrift. I now turn the podium over to you.
Well, thank you so much for those kind welcomes. Let me start by saying how good it is to see so many friends here, and from Davis and from Placer County and from all points around the region. Obviously, I'm partly here, I suppose, to give more volume to Warwick's proposition to set up a campus in Placer County. But I also am very hopeful that that will lead to more cooperation with Davis, and indeed some of that I think has probably already started. Right, universities are, well, universities, and I could have given a talk about higher education, but I thought, why not? I'll actually do something academic. So that's what I'm going to do. The reason for that is that my academic career has been in geography. And recently I was asked to write, if you like, a defense of the discipline. And I thought, right, well, I'll give it a go. A few thousand words later, I got to this point of view, which, by the way, is far too long for a lecture of 40 minutes. So this will be the cut-down version, if I can put it that way. But the menu for the talk, I think, is very straightforward. I want to start, actually, with, if you like, the nub of the matter of geography, actually how we know where we are at all. And that actually is a substantial question in its own right. And over the last few thousand years, it's occupied an awful lot of people's attention. Then I want to talk a bit about how we feel where we are, and I'll talk about that in some detail. I probably won't talk about infrastructure, so that's the bit that Mario will have to cut out of the comments because there won't be time. And then I'm going to talk about the way in which people actually stabilize spaces. And I'm going to talk a bit about the state and a bit about the economy. The reason I'm attracted, though, to geography is very straightforward. It is because, in a sense, it's, I suppose, the science of difference. We live in a world that's fundamentally diverse. Fundamentally diverse. It's a world of really innumerable complexity. And geography is about documenting that diversity in its many facets. And I think it's worth pointing up just how stunning and rich that diversity is, because sometimes people can actually forget that. First of all, just take the total mass weight of living things on the planet, the weight of life, if you like, and I mean that quite literally. It's reckoned to be about 1.7 trillion tons. Now, don't ask me how they calculated this. I read it in a book. I didn't go out and do it myself. The overwhelming majority of that quantity, by the way, is plant life, probably about 99%. The total human mass is about 350 tons. Cows add in another 520 million tons, another reason why we've got to get rid of cows. There are about 4,200 million tons of fish and 2,700 million tons of ants. Bacteria weigh in nearly the same as all other living things put together at about 1.3 trillion tons again. Now take into account the fact they're estimated to be between 5 and 100 million different species of plants and animals. Believe me, no one knows the exact number. We're talking about serious estimation here. And many of those species, of course, remain to be described and archived. Now take in the fact that if you put all this biomass together and all of these species together, you get vast ecological complexity, and that's before you get to human beings. Human beings, once you stir those into the mix, have had an enormous impact on the Earth's surface, that geographers, of course, have known for a long time. We live in what's now called the Anthropocene, and we can argue about when it started, what it is, and goodness knows what else. But everyone, I think, agrees that human beings have had a fairly substantial impact on the Earth's surface, and indeed below and above the Earth's surface. Of course, we can talk about climate change, but we can talk in all sorts of other ways as well. The most extraordinary figure I could find is that global civilization is powered by around 13 terawatts of human-made energy. To give you some point of comparison, the primary production of the biosphere versus photosynthesis is 130 terawatts. The Earth receives 170,000 terawatts from the sun, but the flux of energy from the center of the Earth is about 40 terawatts. So we're getting at least close to that. Most people think actually that human beings are probably producing about the same amount of energy now or is getting close to plate tectonics, which is quite extraordinary when you think of it in those kinds of terms. And then, of course, that's just for a start. Then keep going with all the other things that humans do. For example, they make things. Lots and lots and lots of things. Here, I found another statistic. By one estimate, an average human being will come across something like 20,000 different objects in their lifetime. I'll give you the reference later. But going on from that, of course, at the same time, human beings are constantly moving around. They move themselves around, but of course they move plants and animals around to the same degree. Now, plants and animals, of course, mix quite well without our help. Of that, there is no doubt whatsoever. We know, for example, that small animals like plants have made extraordinary journeys, journeys which you could regard as a fluke, but they've had remarkable impacts one way or another. But then take what human beings do when they multiply that kind of process. You can talk about, for example, native species. You can argue about really whether such things actually exist anymore. There's a plant that I quite like in ditches near us, which apparently is the most evil plant in Great Britain and has to be destroyed, pulled up any time you see it. I'm not doing that. I like this plant. Or take the rat. The rat has travelled with human beings wherever they've journeyed on the Earth's surface. Indeed, so numerous and well adapted to almost any conditions are rats that they might well claim to be the main beneficiaries of human evolution. The Pacific rat has travelled all around the Pacific, but its travels have been as nothing compared with the Norway rat, which of course is actually from China. Or take the good old cockroach. The average New Yorker is most likely to encounter the German cockroach, which fittingly actually originated in Southeast Asia, whilst the American cockroach is actually a native of Africa. And so it goes on. And then, of course, it doesn't end there. At the moment, we're in a second age of exploration. We've learned to map the Earth in so many multiple ways that it's actually extremely difficult to make sense of it. How are we doing that? By producing even more maps. And that act of exploration itself, I think, is quite extraordinary. So we can talk about the way in which, if you like, the world is being changed by all this movement, and I'm going to talk rather more about it subsequently. We can talk, though, also about the way in which we're also seeing not just all this mixing and diversity, but at the same time, human beings also closing down quite a lot of diversity as they go along. Probably the most classic example of that, I suppose, is the North American passenger pigeon. I think the last one languished in a Cincinnati zoo, if I remember correctly. I think it was about 100 years ago. I've got a strange memory that the centenary of the death was last year. So we can see that happening, and of course that's as nothing compared with some of the species extinctions going on. So we have difference, we also have similarity fighting the way out. Now we can see ourselves as being, if you like, the peak of evolution. No doubt the passenger pigeon did too. But at the same time, I think it's worth remembering what really counts if it turns up in terms of reproducing the world. After all, and I quote from an author, take away humans and the present world will function quite as happily as it did 200,000 years ago. Take away worms and insects and things would start to seriously fall apart. Take away bacteria and viruses and the world would die. So let's come on then to where actually we are. One of the first missions, if you like, of geographical endeavour. In some ways, the one that geographers are most known by. They went out and explored things. I always think, this is a flippant aside, that if I'd been in charge of empires, nothing would have ever happened. I would have just said, this looks extremely dangerous. Why don't we just stay where we are? But that's as maybe. The point is, of course, that maps point to something which is really important, which is actually traversing space is actually really hard work. You only have to think of the Sutter Pass or places like that and actually struggling over them to see the ways in which that's actually the case. And history, of course, is littered with wonderful examples of people getting horribly lost because they didn't know where they were. The British Navy, for example, managed to navigate into just about every coastline in the world at some point in its history because they didn't know where they were, and that's true of many other things one could talk about. But even now, when we think we've got travel safely, if you like, nailed down, it's not true. Your chances of coming home from a drive in your car are pretty high. Let's face it, but they vary massively around the world. Journeying is still actually quite dangerous. Annual death rate in cars at the moment in the UK is about 2.75 per 100,000 inhabitants. In Venezuela, it's up in the 30s. I did pick, of course, just about the most dangerous place to drive, but still, it makes the point. And of course, the problem, one of the first things human beings needed to know is where they were and where they were going. And fixing location and wayfinding is, if you like, one of the primary things that human beings have to do. And of course, for a long time, people sailed long distances without charts or without much in the way of instruments. But they still had extremely sophisticated ways of actually traveling. One can talk about, for example, Inuit or Polynesian or Norse or medieval navigators. And of course, those skills of those kinds of sailors could sometimes be extraordinarily sophisticated. And we can talk about the ways in which they did that, for example, Pacific Islanders. But in particular, they were so attuned to, if you like, the behavior of the oceans, they could tell a lot more from it than we would be able to at this point. A lot of that kind of knowledge we've now lost one way or another. But one of the things that I've always been enchanted by is the history of navigation and the way in which a whole series of devices for finding where you are no longer exist. They've been superseded. And with that, all kinds of skills have died out at the same time. But for example, if you wanted to find longitude, all kinds of things that you needed, you don't need anymore. Rudimentary compasses, logs, sandglasses, cross staffs and back staffs, quadrants and sextants, watches, chronometers, all now, if you like, replaced in a kind of bonfire of space by satellite navigation. Bah. Not fair. Going on from that, of course, early nautical travellers possessed only the most rudimentary of maps, and believe me, they were very rudimentary indeed. Of course, that brings us on to when was the first identifiable map actually created? Well, this is the one that currently, I think, holds the prize, though no doubt there'll be someone in the audience who's an expert on maps who will tell me different, and that's fine. This is a map from ancient Egypt dating from 1160 BCE, and it shows recognizably roads and other pathways. There are probably maps from earlier, but we're not sure. And this is much easier to see. There are actually earlier clay maps. They seem to be ways of actually demarcating property, but we're not quite sure about that, I think. Now, of course, from this, we come on to being surrounded by maps one way or another. And of course, the history of maps and mapping was, for a while, I think probably somewhere the end of the 60s into the 70s, really being downplayed. But of course, maps have now come back, as I've said before, in such extraordinary ways, it's almost amazing to actually see. One of the reasons that's happened is simply because people are trying to put together the act of mapping with the act of timing, just as they did with navigation. So what we're seeing are maps which actually start to replicate precisely that way of thinking. And we can see the ways in which time and space have been moved together in geography through history. Now, there are four consequences which have unfolded. One of those, straightforwardly, is the fact that actually it becomes very clear there's pretty well no part of space anywhere you can regard as empty. I was in late last year, the Australian desert. When you first go there, it looks empty, and then when you look around again on the ground, you see just about every track of any kind of animal you can actually think of. Almost nothing actually turns out to be like that. Every space is full, it's just what it's full of. Then, of course, we can understand to a much greater degree than formerly large expanses of time and space. The reason I was in Australia in the desert was to go to a large astronomical array called the Square Kilometer Array, which is going to be the latest sophisticated radio telescope. That spreads all the way across Australia and into South Africa. That allows us to see things that we've never been able to see before. Going the other way, of course, though, we can also see smaller and smaller and smaller things in space and in time. Well, the obvious thing, of course, is the microscope and microscopy of various kinds, but you can think in other ways as well. Just think of international financial trading. And that now depends increasingly on so-called latency, i.e. basically being able to send data much more quickly than anybody else. Going on from that, of course, there's the link between time and space that you find in terms of movement. And I thought here I would go on to a bit of nostalgia. This is for the younger people in the audience. This is going to be extremely confusing. This is what people used to do when they wanted to find things. They had a thing like an A to Z or some kind of gazetteer, and they would find the road, they would drift up and down it, they would ask people where they thought they might be, and so on and so forth. Of course, all that has changed now to a considerable degree. And having said all that, I think we forget just how recent most of these things actually are. You couldn't really have had anything like satellite navigation in cars until the widespread adoption of these devices in the late 90s and early 2000s. And walkers couldn't use simple smartphone apps like Google Maps until the mid-2000s. We take them absolutely for granted already. And of course, there are still relics of the old ways of proceeding. Here's a kind of patriotic moment. But actually, a good example, London taxi drivers. They actually still have to memorize London. They have to memorize every street in London. That's something that people will find incomprehensible as we go on. It's a bit like navigators using cross-staffs or backstaffs. Of that, there is no doubt. And one of the things that's interesting, of course, is that Uber is coming in and these kind of things. And we're seeing, if you like, the death of the spatial craft worker as a result of this. And I have to say, I'm personally very sad about this. But at the same time, as my daughter said, Dad, you're being completely mad. Uber's about half the price. Anyway, finally, there's the question of where we are in space and time. And of course, one of the other things to remember is it's only comparatively recently in history that we've actually been able to see down onto landscapes. You could climb up to a tower, you could find a cliff somewhere, these kind of things. But we see here with the early history of ballooning, people starting to use these kind of things for military survey, and then we go on and on and on. And of course, these kind of things are intensely important, of that there is no doubt, because they presage in particular now a view that we completely take for granted, i.e. looking out of an aircraft window. No one, again, just like with A to Z and this kind of thing, finds that remarkable, and yet, of course, when you think historically, it undoubtedly is. Now, I could go on to talk about other things. For example, the way in which we've also started to think about the Earth as a result of various kinds of inventions, but there we are. Let's come on instead to actually thinking about how we know space. And the one thing I want to say there is that I think it's very important to realize that people have, just like animals, known space in radically different ways. And to some extent, they undoubtedly still do. So just take the case of animals. And you can see the way in which animals see very, very different geographies of the world. And of course, you inevitably work from extremes. A bee, for example, fixes on just a few cues which go to make up its geography. Bright flowers, the sun, those kinds of things. Or take the good old snowy owl. Wintering snowy owls spend 98% of their time sitting still during the day, and probably do most of their hunting after dark using their sight and hearing, and they tend to roam extensively when they hunt. Think about the kind of geography which makes up their world. We fix on a very different geography from that. And human beings, of course, aren't so different from animals in the way that they actually do perceive the spaces that they're in. At one level, our spatial disposition follows from the immense debt we owe to sensation in how we move and thereby think. If you like, it's the way in which our body takes in the world. And that's an extraordinarily variable experience through history. Let's take just one obvious example: different bodily experiences of space in ancient Greece and Rome. It's a particularly appropriate example, of course, given that Homer is often regarded as the founding father of geography, whilst Greek geographical knowledge is often thought to underlay the Roman Empire, as evidenced by Strabo's geography. Just as the ancient Greeks and Romans probably had different words for colours than us, so they had different means of apprehending space. So there's no word in ancient Greek that simply and unproblematically maps onto what we now think of as space. And there's considerable debate about how accurate Greek maps were anyway. Going on from that, the Roman spatium meant stretch or extent, and again, it's not equivalent to what we think of as space. Equally, Greek and Roman cities and sacred sites were run on very, very different spatial principles, which I haven't got time to go into, but it's quite remarkable what's actually happened in terms of archaeology recently as people have started to put data together about these kind of things rather than working in just one site around a city or this kind of thing. So we need to be very, very careful about how we think about people perceiving space, especially if you, of course, look at the anthropological record. Now, I know there are anthropologists in the audience, so I'm going to be taking my life in my hands by talking about this, but just think about some of the different ways in which people can actually think about space. Perhaps the one which is most often cited is simply totemist cultures of one kind or another. And in that scheme of things, each person belongs to a group which bears the name of and is linked to a natural object like an animal or a plant or an artifact or even a natural phenomenon like a river, which is associated with a set of moral, physical and behavioral attributes. It's a living expression, if you like, of qualities of existence. And the classic example of this is usually regarded as so-called Australian dreamtime, a single word which of course sums up many different kinds of things. And in this experience, primeval beings emerge from the depths of the earth from specific sites. Some embarked on journeys which left their marks on the landscape, and behind them they strew many of the existing beings of the day, all manner of humans, plants, and animals, each with their respective affiliations. And these primeval beings might well be human in terms of their behavior, language, and social codes, but they also had the attributes of plants or animals, and they're the origin of stocks of spirits laid down at the sites where they themselves disappeared. And dreaming isn't just ancient history, for when the beings departed, they left a legacy of spirits, of roots and rituals which continue to infirm their presence in the landscape. The paths continue to thread their way through the landscape, rather, I suppose, trying to think of a reasonable analogy like underground maps or something like that, or subway systems with which we're now so familiar. And your peregrination around that landscape continually reaffirms those kind of things. And they express a living relationship with the land, which we, to a degree at least, have certainly lost, if indeed we ever had it in quite the same way to begin with. So the country may be mother or grandfather, which grows them up and is grown up by them. And these kinship terms impose mutual responsibilities of caring and keeping upon the land and people. For many Indigenous Australians, person and place or country are virtually interchangeable. So when you move people, as actually often happen, you are really ripping part of their existence out of them at the same time. And those cultural differences show up in other ways. I'm a great admirer of a cognitive anthropologist called Stephen Levinson, who's worked on Australian and Mexican groups. And he's able to show that they actually do see space in quite different ways. And that actually is a remarkably difficult thing to do. But for example, some of those people can actually know where they are. They know where they are all the time. They actually, in a landscape, can locate themselves. And they perceive cardinals like up and down in quite different ways. These are remarkable things, I think, and to leach them out of the archive of humanity, I think, is a tragedy in all sorts of ways. Finally, of course, there are examples of how technology changes spatial perception. The most obvious one of those, I think, is simply light. First gaslighting appeared in Pall Mall in London in 1807 and then spread all over the place. Now, of course, we take artificial lighting as simply being the standard. But we shouldn't overestimate that process. In India, in 2012, the largest electrical blackout in human history left 600 million people without power and therefore light. However, discussing the blackout, the economist Amartya Sen wryly noted that the media, panicking at this awful thought, neglected the fact that 200 million of those 600 million people never had any power at all. But our apprehension of space, of course, is not just about simple advances in technology. It's about the way in which culture continually remolds how we think of space. And so here I've taken the example of Picasso, mainly because in many ways Picasso, I think, was a kind of space warrior. The thing he most wanted to do was change how we thought about room. And his later paintings in particular are an explicit attack on precisely standard ways of doing that. I haven't got time to go into that, but I think it is important to say that. Now, I've got 10 minutes left. I can do 5 on the state and 5 on the economy, so that's easy. Right. Let's move on then. Let's start then with spaces. You now have found ways of moving through them, and you perceive them in relatively standardized ways. But still, there are going to be ways in which you're going to want to stabilize and standardize them. How's that actually done? There are 2 main agencies that do that. The first of those is the state, and the second, I think, is the economy. Now, I'm talking in very general terms in talking about this, but I still think it's actually worth trying to do that. Now, of course, let's not make too much of the state. You shouldn't exaggerate its powers. Indeed, in many countries, until relatively recently, states often had very little purchase on people's everyday lives. In others, of course, they did. More recently, as we've seen the bureaucratic weight of files, paperwork, manuals, offices, waiting rooms, examinations, notions of conduct and habit, all these kind of things, so we start to see the spaces of states becoming more stabilized and standardized. And of course, geography is utterly complicit in this particular history, because the whole profession of geography appeared in many ways as a means of producing states, with its own research methods, terminology, career paths, academic departments, textbooks, journals, dependent in particular upon the practice of exploration. And we can see this in all sorts of ways, whether we're talking about things like the way in which the state started to map countries of various kinds. Here's the British Ordnance Survey, but you could equally talk about the gridding of the United States, but also the way in which those things work against each other. So that things which were meant as military surveys in many cases, then of course became largely tourist and vacation devices as they went on. Equally, of course, we can see the way in which these kinds of maps also turn into ways in which the state asserts itself in other ways, in particular, for example, in terms of surveillance of one form or another. If you think a lot about a lot of what states do nowadays, it's surveillance through mapping of one kind or another. Coordinate, coordinate, coordinate. Of course, having said all that, different states hold very different notions still of the world. I often think the best example of this is probably Imperial China and Imperial Chinese maps, where you find the central kingdom in the classic maps surrounded by a series of small countries where basically people who were not members of Central Kingdom lived, and you drew the particular judgment from that. Indeed, when the Jesuits actually started to produce accurate maps of China, it became quite controversial, precisely because of the fact it looked like it was decentering China as it was doing that. Going on from that now, of course, we've probably reached the high watermark of states one way or another, and one of the reasons for that is information technology. So, for example, of course, state spaces still exist, but there are many spaces which are only partly of them nowadays. Global cities like London, New York, and Shanghai, various ecological enclaves, diasporic communities, global brands, special economic zones, massive computational networks, logistical networks, financial markets, special offshore domains, and so on and so forth. And of that, of course, is in large part, because of the ability of people to put together information technology networks which are based on remarkably large server farms of one kind or another, and which in turn, of course, generate extraordinary demands for electricity, for power. At the moment, it's predicted by 2020, an estimated 1.9 terawatts of power will place the cloud, if we're a nation state, as the 5th largest consumer of electricity in the world. But perhaps we shouldn't be too surprised by this diversity of institutional spaces. Before the 17th century, millions of acres weren't strictly owned by any one person or institution. Rather, they were subject to a patchwork of rights of one form or another. They were held in common, though we have to be very careful what we mean by that. It's not some kind of nice, dreamy thing. It was very carefully thought out. Lastly, I'll come to the economy very, very briefly, only to say that one of the problems we face, I think, at this point in time is that we tend to think that every patch of land on the earth is actually owned. That is not even vaguely the case. Nearly 15% of the Earth's surface has been preserved for conservation in areas like national parks. Rather more, I think, than most people might think. We can argue about how well enforced some of those national parks are, but at the same time, it's important to note that. But even if that is the case and that we're talking about ownership, we have to be very careful not to talk about this in simple terms as being about, say, something called the world economy. The world economy only exists as a continual construction. A construction of all kinds of different and overlapping spatial networks. Just take maritime trade. The only reason it keeps going is because right at this moment in time, there are about 100,000 freighters on the seas. Without that, it wouldn't happen. And you can see a good example of that recently with the Port of San Francisco. So these kind of things are really important one way or the other. I was terrified to find recently, I was in the control room of the grid for national gas in the UK, and they worked out that if a freighter didn't turn up or a ship didn't turn up within the next 3 days with a very large amount of natural gas, we were going to have quite serious problems in the UK. So these things are really just in time. They're not just a matter of something trivial. But I wanted to just end, I think, by looking in particular at the way in which ownership has come about, and I thought I'd use the sea again. And the reason for that is because recently there have been 2 or 3 books come out which are just beautiful books on the so-called Selden map. This is a map which was bequeathed to the Bodleian Library in Oxford in 1654. It's a 16 2/3 square feet map of China. And what's interesting about it, this is fiddled, by the way. It doesn't look like this. It's been redone in various ways so that you can see the boundaries of China and other parts of the Pacific. What we can see about this is an attempt, actually, to start asserting ownership in the strongest possible sense. And at the same time, Selden, who was very much involved with this map, was also one of the first people to actually try to think of ways in which the law could own the sea. And indeed, one of his books was called The Closed Sea. What he wanted to do was produce absolute ownership by nation states of all parts of the waves. Something which continues to this very day. It has to be said, you only have to look at the Pacific now. Going on from that, of course, trade has the most remarkable ways of appearing in our lives. I always get my students to look at where their clothes and everything on their body comes from as one example of that. I know this shirt comes from Thailand because I looked. So these kind of things, I think, are important to note. And going on from that, of course, we then end up with vast amounts of junk, which people are trying very hard to get rid of, with only partial success. And we also end up with other kinds of things. And in a bow to Mario and his work on intellectual property, we end up in particular with the fact that people try to stop ideas, patents and these kinds of things from circulating. There is a wonderful, wonderful set of histories of industrial espionage. Which for a long time was a way, in fact, of making sure that things didn't circulate, not that they did. So, for example, if you look in the United States, it had an explicit policy of pinching ideas from the British. The British had an explicit policy of stopping the US from taking those ideas. For example, they wouldn't export machines, and skilled workers were banned from emigrating. And again, of course, the British could hardly say they were pure either. If you think about the row there is over China at the moment, it's worth putting this in historical perspective. One of the great British coups, of course, was by the 19th century Scottish botanist Robert Fortune, who basically sneaked into China in disguise and managed both to steal a large collection of tea plants and the technique for processing tea leaves, meaning that China no longer had a monopoly on the world tea trade, and instead tea could be grown in India. And these kind of things are also very important. What I was going to end with was to talk a little bit about the way in which ideas themselves circulate. There isn't time to do that. but in particular I was going to talk about music, which of course is now one of the most extraordinary ways in which all kinds of emotions and ideas actually circulate. And then I was going to end up by bringing all this together by actually talking about cities. And the reason for that is actually very straightforward. In the end, I think it's a truism, but it is also true. It's, if you like, at the moment, the fundamental fact of geography that we've got to sort out cities. That's where most people are going to end up living, and at the moment, they are in many cases severely dysfunctional. And the engineering of cities so that they are not dysfunctional, both socially and technically, I think, is probably one of the greatest things that we actually have to do at this point in time. With that almost biblical notion, I will stop. Thank you very much. Nearly on time, nearly. Do you know, I think that was 40 minutes, remarkable.
So I have some comments and some questions for Professor Thrift that I will kind of bring up sequentially. So rather than talk for another 10 minutes and
Feel free.
no.
You can have a rest.
So it's actually quite challenging to come up with specifically contained and containable questions, because the structure of Professor Thrift's paper that I was able to see before he spoke actually maps the material that he's trying to work with. So the connections, effectively, the last paragraph connects with the first, and all the intermediate paragraphs, connect with everything else. So I'll try to tease out some patterns that I think are visible from the talk, but they're perhaps more visible from the paper. So the first one is that going back to the two starting questions on the first slide, that is how we know where we are and how we feel where we are. So throughout the paper, it seems like these two questions effectively are two themes that kind of run diachronically through the narrative. So the first question, how do we know where we are, is in a sense that, if you want, the scientific dimension of geography, figuring out where we are, how we can get to another place, and so on, which is, but also how to mark properties, so where property boundaries are. So the example you showed us was for the earliest maps may have been property maps. So even something that, if you want, perhaps predates the state, but may be evidence of local property arrangement. So property maps, road maps, charts, perhaps nautical charts. So they're all part of this set of concerns that geography engages with, that has to do with where we are and how do we get where we want to go. And then we have the second one that instead it's about the experience, our experience of space. And there are, especially in the long text, a number of, I wouldn't say, not kind of oppositions between these two lines, between, if you want, the quote scientific part of geography versus the geography that deals with experience. So they're not opposed as good or bad or anything like that. But you use, for instance, you attach the notion of absolute space to the first, instead the notion of relative space to the second, meaning the notion of experiencing space, dwelling in space as something that is, again, experienced, and so on. in the case of experience, you mentioned the term place. In the other, instead when you talk about, quote, scientific geography, you talk about space. So there are a series of ongoing, sharp differentiations between these two kind of dimensions. Also, observe versus field, mind versus hand, and so on. So I wanted to ask you, and then there is an interesting twist that you seem to suggest that it's the geography of experience, the geography that studies our experience of space that seems to be connected to, for lack of a better term, we can call kind of environmental thinking. Meaning thinking about relations and the kind of thinking that may be important to articulate an environmental policy. So I have more questions about this, but first I would like to get your reaction about the relationship between these two themes, whether, and what are the modes of interaction between these two themes, because, for instance, one thing that you mentioned in the paper was, sometimes, map making, charts, and so on starts out as a political, military project, but then you may have tourist guides that come out of it, right? Same thing, we could say the same thing about GPS. GPS certainly starts as a military technology, and now if you want to go fish in the Bay Area, probably you need a GPS. So you have these kind of examples of a state project of scientific geography that then drifts into ways of experiencing space. So tell us more about how these two dimensions of geography kind of connect or don't.
Okay, I mean that's an absolutely fair point. Just to say that the paper is structured in a way that it looks like there's some kind of opposition between those. Of course there isn't. They inform each other in the strongest possible way. So for example, even if you look at feeling nowadays, a lot of people are trying very hard to measure that in particular ways. To some degree, even if it's in reductionist ways, they will probably be successful. In doing that, that will feed back into the culture. Mm-hmm. So I'm not by any means trying to make out these things actually are unrelated. But I suppose the example that I always take, that I like, I did a lot of work on the historical geography of clock time. And one account of this was a very straightforward one. It was that clock time came in as a kind of rational, instrumental means of proceeding. And that it was intimately associated in particular with the arrival of industry, and was intimately associated with making sure that people turned up to work on time, etc., etc., etc. If you actually look, the account is way more complicated than that. The first accounts of the use of clock time that we were able to find are ages before the birth of, if you like, what one might call capitalist industry. And they're around much more interesting things in some ways. They're around things like love affairs, which so far as I know is about feeling. They're around things like gambling, because those are things which were practical things that people could do straight off. In any case, they already knew that if their employer was trying to rip them off, they were going to try and think of ways that they wouldn't be. So very early on, you find these kind of things interacting. People are looking at work time. They're also looking at affairs. They're also looking at gambling. That's one thing. So these things may come in for one purpose. They're rapidly appropriated for all kinds of other purposes. Going on from that, you find that another thing that's important is that actually this so-called rationality itself becomes an aesthetic. Mm-hmm. People are terribly bothered. They like in an excruciatingly emotional way, accuracy. They like accuracy when there's absolutely no reason to be that accurate. And again, that's an extraordinarily interesting thing, I think, and something that we're trying to work through. The most famous piece of accuracy we have in the book is the Elizabethan mage John Dee. And there's a wonderful set of passages in one of his works where he's timing the arrival of someone called Gabriel. And he's timing them absolutely down to the most accurate point he can. And everyone thinks, God, this is so extraordinarily rational. It's incredible. Who's he timing? He's timing the arrival of an angel. And we just have to be careful to understand there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that people don't put things together in the ways that people often assume they actually do. And we have to be very careful, therefore, not to make those judgments straight off. Going on from that, of course, one of the things that is incredibly important about modern information technology, about things like GPS, is that actually, of course, they are doing lots of things at once, just as clocks used to. And they're used for lots and lots of different things. And you cannot really have one account of them. And you have to understand that most of the time they're about different kinds of practices within which a technology is embedded, rather than the technology which leads to particular practices. I don't know if that helps at all.
Yes, no, it does. So I would like to ask you about geography as an academic discipline, given that also I think that that's part of the genealogy of the talk you gave. So the way you define, actually I wouldn't say that you define, but the way you describe geography and its materials, its approaches, is very, very capacious. So I'm thinking about often the kind of discussions. The way you discuss the material could be, okay, an anthropologist could certainly relate to that. When you come to cities, you can imagine people from urban studies saying, yes, he's doing our job. It looks like perhaps art historians might also get in line.
Or I'm doing their job.
And this is certainly not meant as a criticism. I'm just, it's more like I'm really intrigued by, the fact that if you describe geography as, a discipline or a mode of inquiry into people's relationship with space, it basically takes over a lot of the social sciences, some of the sciences, and some of the humanities. So I assume that because you run Warwick, you can somewhat perhaps be a little imperialistic about geography there. But
we don't have geography at Warwick.
You don't?
No.
So was that part of the deal that you could not have?
So the story is, I probably shouldn't be saying this on film. The story is that way back, I think in the 60s or 70s, there was a movement to have a geography department in Warwick, and they went out to a set of referees and asked them whether there should be. And a couple of quite well-known geographers from the time said, oh, no. I will not say what their names were. So that's the reason, and it's never come back since then.
Okay. So I'm sorry to hear that. But back to the issue of geography's place in relation to neighboring disciplines, both especially in the social sciences, but also in the humanities and the sciences. So what would be the tree of knowledge? Although we are not supposed to talk about trees anymore, the rhizome of knowledge. Given your view of what geography could do?
So I think I'd say in three ways, really. I think first thing to say is I think the good thing about geography is it does put a lot of very different things together one way or the other. And it tries to make unexpected associations. It tries to do that. It's not something that it's trying to do by accident. I think it's trying to make those associations. I think that's incredibly important, actually. The second thing is to say, though, but of course, we live in interdisciplinary times. And more, I think you can see the way in which lots and lots of people are doing things that in previous decades would have been done within a much more specific division of labour. I don't think that actually any longer figures in quite the same way. I've spent my career working with people from lots and lots of different kinds of disciplines, and it's been a joy to do. And I've never really seen there's any reason why I shouldn't. Let me put it that way. No doubt people who've read my work will. But I mean, I think it's one of those things where, for me at least, there are enormous dividends to be had from, if you like, transcending disciplinary boundaries without necessarily trying to get rid of them altogether. Going on from that, I think the third thing to say is, of course, that some of the themes that geographers held dear, in particular around space, to some degree actually around environment. If you look at the environmental literature, much of it was being produced by geographers in the 40s, 50s and so on through, has simply been taken up by everybody. And pretty well all disciplines now talk about space in some form or the other. We can argue about what that's meant by each discipline, but I think the fact of the matter is that is the case. So it's a kind of, it's almost like the kind of trade I was talking about before. It is reformatting the intellectual world, and I actually think on the whole for the good. Not always, but mainly, I think. Mm-hmm. Does that help?
Yes. Yes.
You look very skeptical, always. I can never quite tell.
No. I'm profoundly interested in the, in the pros and cons of interdisciplinarity, and especially the way you represent, geography and the emphasis on, basically, the study of relations, experiences and so on.
So let me give you examples then of where I think you can see interdisciplinarity at work, which both isn't. So I think this is proving to be, for a relatively small number of people, I'd be the first to admit, historical geographers, a kind of killing time. I think they're doing absolutely brilliant work, and I think interdisciplinarity has kind of opened up the frontiers of what they think they can do. Mm-hmm. And I think they're doing genuinely great work. And what am I thinking of? Well, I'm thinking in particular, let me just think, colleague of mine, actually, who's now in the history department at Warwick, David Lambert, mm-hmm. Is doing remarkable work on Caribbean civilizations, and in particular is looking at the way in which the explorers of the 19th century who came back and wrote books, and people who never explored at all, who were armchair explorers, actually were drawing a lot of the time on indigenous knowledge, in particular of slaves. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that knowledge has tracked its way, in various ways, into what looked like remarkable scientific accounts. Now, those kind of things, I think, are things that we wouldn't have thought about in quite the same way, and historical geographers have been able, if you like, to take a full grasp on that in ways which are really wonderful to see.
So let me ask you a follow-up question on the, if you want, a question of method. That is, how can one get to describing, understanding, people's relations with space and their experience with space. So you have some, really fascinating, and I really appreciate the fact that you are not shy about this. So you have lines, this is in the paper. Geography doesn't just document the diversity and richness, blah, blah, blah. It is about difference and what that means. It is about the connections in each moment that lead to change. And then at the end of the paper, there is this other line, geography, the guardian of difference. And then you go on. So the argument, as I understand it, is that geography is not simply about mapping, difference, both spatial, cultural, and so on, but it's really about how people, by virtue of being people and engaging space, they create difference. They change themselves, they change their surroundings, they change other people's, animals, blah, 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 right? So I completely agree with this. This is great. Now, yes, I completely agree. Now, here comes the historian in me. Okay, and where do you find the evidence to study that? That is, historical actors, typically they leave diaries, some of them may leave diaries behind, which they describe the events, but rarely you have, they leave behind traces that describe their relationship with space. I mean, they might occasionally, but, wills are not going to be a document for this kind of evidence. You mentioned at one point an anthropologist who basically managed to figure out something about a certain culture's ability to orient themselves and so on. But that's something you can test because you can...
And he carefully tested it.
So, but that's something that you can test. But most of the time, what evidence do you have to study how people experience space? Meaning, you can do it on yourself. I mean, and that's why I completely agree with you. I mean, I understand exactly what you mean by, engaging, with space and changing yourself and everything as you do that. But how do you study other people doing it?
So I can tell you in part, I did once do with a colleague of mine, Paul Glennie, a history book. And we were trying to, on time,
yes.
And we were trying to look at how people told the time in the past, for which you would think there's almost no archive at all, because it is such a common thing to do that people just don't write it down, and they don't. They don't come in and say, right, today I carefully, looked at my clock, did this, did that, and such like. But what you can find when you actually start looking is an extraordinary record of different kinds of things. And I think one of the rules is look for disputes. Mm-hmm. So when people are actually arguing about these things, because it's not like in any society just one interpretation of what space is like circulates. It's often that all kinds of interpretations actually, and you look for the disputes that actually work in terms of that. And you can see many of those. So that in terms of the English historical record, one of the best ones is legal cases. Once you're in court, boy, oh boy, you can see the disputes coming out. Yes. You should know this better than I. I don't think there's any doubt that things like that form a valuable record. There are things like diaries, actually, and they go back quite a long way in time. There are all kinds of account books which have all kinds of incidentals written in them. There are even things like receipts. There are the things like this which actually do make a difference. What that means is you have, if you like, a kind of history made up in part of fragments. I don't dispute that. But then I don't think that's such a terrible thing necessarily. Probably that's what life's like anyway.
Yes. No, certainly, I think anybody doing empirical work would certainly relate with that predicament of having to look for fragments wherever they are and put the pieces together.
And then, going on from that, of course, one of the other things to say is, of course, you also see in the writings of any time particular notions of space actually coming out. So if you look, there are many environmentalists who are convinced there is, if you like, a kind of spirit of place of some kind or another. And indeed, there's remarkably interesting work going on at the moment, trying to pull that out in different kind of fantastical ways. I'm thinking, I've just been reading Jeff van der Meer's trilogy. I don't know if you know this at all, about a kind of spooky area on the Florida coast called Area X, which is kind of really place writing taken to an nth degree. It's quite extraordinary, this kind of thing. In the UK, there's a thing called the Dark Mountain Collective, which is trying to do the same kind of thing, often in ways which strike me as not very friendly to humanity, but that's neither here nor there. But these kind of things, I think, are part of, in a way, people trying to produce a new kind of interpretation of what space is like, which will, if you like, supersede some of the ways that currently exist. Whether they'll be actually correct or not is another matter altogether.
So, because I think we should open up for questions from the public, but I wanted to ask you, I mean, if this is interesting or relevant to you. I thought that the last part that you had to breeze through because of time constraints, the section on cities was really interesting, and specifically, if I read you correctly, you seem to say that cities, for all the problems that they have and that we are aware of, because of almost like the way that they compress human spatial interactions, they almost like become almost like a laboratory of people thinking and learning about space. So at least as I was reading the chapter, I kept thinking about, Latour's laboratory kind of analysis.
And of course, he wrote a book on Paris. Which
yes, through the metro. Yeah. So and there was a line about that you seem to suggest that perhaps if we kind of understand cities, we might also be. We might develop tools that could be interesting to address environmental issues. Would you mind to expand a little bit on that part?
No, I'm happy to actually.
Okay.
It's partly because a colleague of mine, Ash Amin, and I are trying to write a book on cities at the moment, and we're trying to think in particular. This is the missing section we didn't talk about in the paper about infrastructure. So we're trying to think about all the ways in which life is made predictable in cities through roads, pipes, wireless signals, goodness knows what. And the fact of the matter is, we're actually now seeing, if you like, the surface of the Earth becoming extraordinarily calculable in a strong way, about a mile and a bit up, I think, about 2 miles down, I can't remember exactly. So these kind of things are interesting in their own right in terms of what you can do with them. And one of the points we're trying to make in the book is that what we really need to think about at this point is engineering. And we're not saying this in some grandiose fashion, but we are saying that part of the problem at the moment is that we split apart all kinds of things that ought to be put together. And I'm thinking in particular of social science and building, for example, and making things. That shouldn't happen. Now, interestingly, if you look in higher education, hooray, I've got higher education in, there are actually examples at the moment of people trying to produce curricula which would not have those divisions. Now, you can argue about whether they're successful or not, but they're saying you have got to become an expert who can actually do the social science, then make the things, and then actually produce in all sorts of ways the aesthetics that go with that, so that these things become popular. Mm-hmm. And it's a kind of art, I suppose, of kind of displacement or something of that kind. But I think that kind of engineering is going to become increasingly important. Where am I thinking of? Places like Olin College in Massachusetts have been trying to do these kind of things. They did it for, in some ways, slightly different reasons. They did it in part because they couldn't get women to do engineering. But actually, if you reframe engineering to make it, in a sense, I was trying to think of a way of putting this, if there are engineers in the audience, even more interesting, there might be all sorts of things that you can do with it that actually aren't done at the moment. And we're now cooperating with a small college in England, in part because we want to see if we can make the curriculum work there. If we can, we would try and pull it into our university. Because people have got to think across the box, if I can put it that way, in cities, more and more. At the moment, what they do is people do bits of it, and the result of that, I think, is actually a lot of the time things which are phenomenally antisocial.
they're signaling me that I have monopolized you for way too long. So we should open for questions from the public. So I think there are traveling microphones. If you can yes, here. Here's the...
Thank you for a fascinating discussion of geography. But I had I'm a retired geology professor. And so my one question is, as I remember, geography had two parts. One was social geography, which is what we've heard about this afternoon, and physical geography. Is that still a part of geography? And should it be? And should one have undergraduate instruction in that field? And if so, where? If not, in the geography department?
So let me be very clear about this. One of the things I think is the best thing that happened about my geography education is I was forced to interact with physical geographers. And the result was only for the good, actually. And because one of the things I've always struggled to talk about in terms of geography is that it is a very concrete discipline. And one of the ways in which it's tied down is precisely through physical geography. Going on from that, though, of course, one of the other things to note, and when people talk about the Anthropocene or whatever you want to call it, what they're talking about, in a sense, is a social geography which is becoming a physical geography. That actually what we're seeing are layers and layers of various kinds of activity actually almost being laid down. There's quite a few books now. There's a very nice book by a man, I can never pronounce his name right, called Zlasovich or something like that, showing exactly the way in which we will see, if you like, the signals of humanity now ending up in the geological record. And they're going to end up pretty dramatic, if a little thin, I suspect. These are really interesting things, I think, to think through. So the idea that you can have, if you like, human geography without physical geography, for me, is a non sequitur. I don't think it makes any sense. Even though, having said all that, I won't mind not seeing another climate change model for a while.
Well, I want to thank you so much for this amazing discussion. The question that I have for you is, you spoke about relationship between humans and space. How has the internet and social media changed that relationship? It seems at times that it has really warping space in ways that we have not seen in the past.
Right. It's like most technologies, it's changed certain things. And if you just look at the things that have changed, you think everything's changed. But other things, I don't think it's changed all that much at all. And I suppose I'd probably come back. So let's take a higher education example. There's an enormous amount of discussion at the moment about the way in which virtual learning can almost take over from universities, which would be great for everyone because it would be a lot cheaper, roughly speaking. I think if you look seriously at this as an issue, it's extremely difficult actually to see that happening, except for a very few subjects where there are certain things you have to know and you can write them in tests and you can tick them off. But most learning, especially in universities, is really not like that. And it requires learning with other people to actually become ingrained in what they do. So I look at the British Open University, which is one of the most successful distance learning operations in the world. It has a vast physical infrastructure of tutors of one kind or another, and the students actually, I think, would find it very difficult a lot of the time without that. I'm not saying it's impossible. And as we go on, it may become more possible. So, for example, the Open University now has you being able to do science experiments online and these kinds of things. But I think it's a long way away, and I'm not really convinced by it. And the reason for that is that when people learn, they're taking in all kinds of signals which are still difficult to transmit over the net. They're becoming easier to transmit, but it's going to take a long while yet, I think. I'm not sure that really helps. If I look at the internet more generally, I think it is changing some things remarkably. But other things I think are pretty static, actually. But the things that it's changing, I think, are in particular things like the machinery of human relationship. One of the things that I think people actually underestimate, and I'll use a rough analogy, there's some wonderful historical geography work on the way in which the advent of the bicycle produced much greater marriage distances for people. They could get out and about. They therefore potentially could meet lots and lots more partners. Now, the internet is doing the same in terms of dating at this point in time. And we laugh at this, but actually dating is quite important to a lot of people. And these things are really not trivial. And these kind of things, I think, are changing, and they may actually be changing things rather more than some of the more military applications that we talk about as ooh-ah things.
Yes.
Sir, as a global geographer, do you have any views on the decline and fall of the nation state and the hegemonic empires that could take over in its afterplace? Now you're coming into areas I really can pronounce on and honestly say I don't know much about. I think the nation state will carry on into the indefinite future one way or the other, and the reasons for that I think are pretty obvious. They consist of boundaries, they consist of armies, they consist of a whole series of things which are not about to disappear very quickly. So that's one thing. On top of that, of course, the nation-state relies on an enormous bureaucracy, which in itself, of course, employs simply vast numbers of people. And before we start talking about getting rid of those kind of things, we should think about the dangers of doing that. Going on from that, though, and I did touch on this in the talk, it is being hollowed out in various ways. There are parts of the world where you can see other kinds of entities coming into existence. The UK is interesting at the moment, where you can see the United Kingdom as a nation-state becoming disunited, I suppose, in quite strong ways. But one of the things that's least remarked upon, but which is probably most interesting, is actually the case of London. And the scary thing for the United Kingdom will be if there is a London independence movement. Under certain circumstances, I can actually see that happening. At this point in time, the makeup of the average Londoner is massively different from that of the rest of the country. Wildly more diverse in all sorts of ways, a lot younger, a lot better off in many cases, doesn't fully understand increasingly why they're paying, as they see it, for the rest of the country, when all Londoners want to do is go there to visit. So there are a whole series of things like this which are really interesting. And you can see the same things, I think, under certain circumstances, even in places like New York. And I think what I would be interested in is some kind of populist politician who really starts making that case. Because actually, I think they'd have a good chance. You know, I think it would require some skills, but they're not massive ones. We have in London at the moment Boris Johnson, who's a remarkable mayor of the city, and every now and then you can see him chafing at the bit. I could run this myself, I suspect he's thinking. So there are some interesting things, I think, to be thinking about that. And it's that kind of thing where bits of nation states fall away, which I think is the most interesting thing at the moment. On top of that, of course, we have had things like the international financial system, which certainly for a period of time reigned pretty sovereign, I think, for one reason or another. But I think at the same time you can see nation states saying, right, this is quite far enough. And there's a pretty serious fight back going on about that. So there's these seesawings going on. But I think we will see, there's a very nice book by Bratton just come out, which looks precisely at the way all these different other spatial entities are coming into existence, which have quite high degrees of independence in their domain, but which can spill over into something more interesting as time goes on.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. I'm a historian of the British Empire, and I know that you have written about this earlier, but in the context of your talk today, I cannot resist the temptation of asking you one more time. Hearing your talk between the lines, it seemed to me that that you were suggesting in some ways the reproducibility and the accessibility of the mapped image in a certain time of world history. You know, all those surveys, ordnance surveys, you know, cadastral surveys, hydrographical surveys, etc., creates a certain kind of ease and easy reproducibility of the mapped image at a certain time in world history, if I hear you correctly. I wonder, and you seem to suggest that it can, in some ways, that disenchanted a certain notion of space. The shires, for instance, were not singing anymore, like they did in the older maps of England. If that is the case, I just want to ask you, did it also in some ways disenchant and secularize time as in a fixed, you know, a well-known beginning and a middle and an end? Because, you know, as we know, that human beings can only think of time in spatial metaphors. I mean, if Henri Bergson is to be believed, I think he's right. So I just thought that I should ask you again. I'm sure you've written about this elsewhere. And that actually raises a question about what is the compression of time, of space doing to time right now in the digital age. But that's a much bigger question, probably more complicated.
Okay. So the first thing, just a slight word of warning, and it's my fault. Just because you have mapped images doesn't mean you're in control of something. If you think of the British Empire, it had lots of mapped images, but I think one would doubt that large parts of it were necessarily in control. One thinks of Afghanistan, and that seems to be a continuing thing in all sorts of ways. So those kind of things I think are important to note. It was beautifully mapped, by the way. Going on from that, the compression of space, what it's doing to time. I'm not sure myself, if I'm honest. So for a time, there was a moment in the geographical literature where people would mention what they called time-space compression, as though it kind of solved things, as if it explained things. And I'm really not sure that it does that at all, actually. One, because it's extraordinarily differential. Just because there are quite a few people who can fly around the world, you know, pretty well at their bidding, there are plenty of other people, probably the vast majority, for whom that is not even slightly the case. And we need to be very careful about that. On the other hand, those people who are in that position can still have mobile phones, which actually do link them pretty well instantaneously. So there are all kinds of things that are going on, I think, and all kinds of movements which people have differential access to. And a lot of those things don't add up to a single process, I think. And that's the problem. And I don't think it's really necessary that they actually do that. So I'm always trying to teeter along the edge of a kind of general explanation which kind of at the same time doesn't get too general. Because, for example, one of the other things that I don't much like, whereas other people do, is that, for example, there's a thing called modernity, and that kind of, somehow or the other, when that happens, it explains a lot of things all at once. I really doubt that. I'm enough of a historian, if I can put it that way, that I kind of quite like detail for its own sake. And, you know, finding those kind of things is great, great, great fun. And I'm not going to have that ruined by massive theories which kind of tell you how you should think about things, if I can put it that way.
Unruly that empire.
Exactly, exactly.
I think we should bring this event to a close, and I would first would like to thank Chancellor Katehi for making this possible, and also I would like to mention that the next speaker in the series will be Donna Shalala, Professor of Political Science and President of the University of Miami, at 4 p.m. on Friday, April the 10th. Prior to serving as president of the University of Miami, Dr. Shalala spent 8 years as U.S. Secretary of Health and Human Services in the Clinton administration. At this time, I would like to invite everybody in the lobby for a reception and the opportunity to have a brief chat with Sir Nigel Thrift. And thank you so much for this wonderful talk.
Well, thank you.